Picture the single flashiest card the original Yu-Gi-Oh anime ever put in front of a camera. It's not Exodia, and it's not one of the Egyptian god cards. It's a plain, pale little spell that lets a duelist smash any two monsters together and summon whatever their imagination can justify. That card is real. You can still buy it for pocket change today, and for well over a decade, competitive players treated it like garbage, a card so bad it belonged next to the cards you'd never actually play. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Polymerization, the card that fused Blue Eyes into Ultimate Dragons and turned Joey's Red Eyes into a skull-faced nightmare on screen, spent years as a punchline in the real game, and why that neglect wasn't an accident, a mistake, or bad luck. It was math. Cold, unglamorous card advantage math that the cartoon never had to deal with. Because the cartoon didn't have rules, it had a script. Start with what the show actually sold you. In the anime, polymerization isn't a mechanic, it's a magic word. Kaiba slaps 3 Blue Eyes white dragons together and gets a card so absurd it needs 3 heads just to hold all that ego. Yugi merges Dark Magician with Buster Blader and gets a dragon-slaying swordsman built specifically to end Kaiba's whole strategy in one attack. Joey combines Summon Skull with his beloved Red Eyes Black Dragon and gets Black Skull Dragon, a monster with a name that sounds like it was written by an 8-year-old at maximum enthusiasm, which, to be fair, it probably was. The show's version of fusion runs entirely on vibes. 2 cool things touch, a cooler thing happens, roll credits, and fans notice the gaps immediately. Yugi's Curse of Dragon and Joey's Red Eyes Black Dragon are both dragons, both iconic, both practically screaming to be smashed together into something with a name like Twin Fang Dragon or whatever 12-year-olds in the early 2000s were doodling in the margins of their notebooks. It never happened. Konami never printed it. And that absence is actually the whole story in miniature, because it points at the one rule the anime conveniently ignores and the real card game absolutely cannot. Here's that rule. In actual duel monsters, polymerization doesn't create anything. It's not a wish-granting genie. It's a delivery mechanism. Somewhere in Konami's print history, a specific fusion monster card has to already exist, listing the exact materials it wants before you're allowed to make it. If Konami never sat down and printed a card called something like Twin Fang Dragon that explicitly demands Curse of Dragon plus Red Eyes Black Dragon as its ingredients, then no amount of polymerization, no amount of imagination, and no amount of angry forum posts will let you fuse them. The anime's polymerization answers to nobody. The real one answers to Konami's print schedule, and Konami, it turns out, was in no hurry. So that's strike 1. Now here's strike 2. And it's the one that actually explains why fusion summoning became a competitive dead zone for years, not just an occasional disappointment. Think about what a normal summon costs you. You play one monster from your hand for free once per turn, and it just sits on the field doing monster things. Now think about what an early fusion summon costs you. You need polymerization in hand. You need the 2 exact name materials in hand. That's 3 specific cards working together just to summon one monster, which then gets discarded straight into your graveyard as fuel the second it's done its job or gets destroyed. In a card game that is fundamentally about resource attrition, about not running out of cards before your opponent does, that math is brutal. You're spending 3 cards to make 1. Anyone who's ever played a trading card game knows that ratio is a death sentence unless the payoff is enormous. And early fusion monsters mostly weren't enormous. They were fine. Solid stat lines, forgettable effects, the kind of card you'd play if you happened to draw the pieces, not the kind of card you'd build your entire strategy around. Compare that to what ritual summoning was already offering around the same era, or what would eventually blow both of them out of the water. Fusion asked you to gather 3 specific cards and then torch 2 of them. That's not a strategy, that's a tax, and taxes don't win regional tournaments. Here's the thesis, plainly, because it's worth saying once before we go further. Fusion summoning wasn't neglected because it was a bad idea. It was neglected because the real game charged full price for a mechanic the anime got for free, and nobody thought to lower the price for over a decade. You might be tempted to defend Konami here. The obvious counterargument is that every extra deck mechanic that ever launched had this exact problem at first, and that's not entirely wrong. Ritual summoning had its own clunky tribute costs, but the difference is that ritual monsters, at least, tended to arrive with actual game-warping effects worth the sacrifice. Cards that could wipe a board or lock down a strategy. Early fusion monsters mostly just had good stats and a cool picture. Kaiba's own Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, the poster child of anime fusion excess, needed you to already own 3 copies of the single most sought-after card in the game, spend 2 of your precious few copies of polymerization-adjacent resources, and what you got in return was a big beater with no protection and no real payoff beyond raw attack power. It looked incredible on television, on a kitchen table against an opponent with actual removal spells. It was a 3-card investment that died to a single trap, and it's not like nobody tried to fix this. Elemental Heroes showed up in the mid-2000s, riding the coattails of the GX spin-off, and they represent the game's first real attempt at fusion. Therapy. Konami started printing support that made the cost slightly less insulting. Cards that let you fuse by banishing materials instead of discarding them. Cards that recycled polymerization back into your hand after use. Cards that streamlined the whole clunky 3-card process into something you could actually build a deck around. It helped. Elemental Heroes became a genuinely playable, genuinely beloved archetype. But notice what didn't change. You still needed polymerization, or one of its increasingly specific cousins. physically in your hand to do anything. The training wheels got nicer, the bike was still the same bike. Meanwhile, the rest of the game kept moving, and this is the part that really sealed Fusion's fate for years. In 2008, Synchro summoning arrived, and it fixed the exact problem Fusion never solved. Almost by accident, Synchro let you build a big extra deck monster using materials you already had sitting on the field, no separate spell card required, no permanent discard tax baked into every single use. It was Fusion's whole pitch, cool extra deck monster, built from other monsters minus the toll booth. Competitive players did the obvious thing. They abandoned the mechanic that charged them extra and flocked to the one that didn't. Fusion didn't just stagnate after that, it got actively lapped, repeatedly, first by Synchro and later by XYZ's summoning, which offered similar convenience with its own spin. For years, opening a handful of Fusion pieces felt less like drawing a strategy and more like drawing a chore. So here's where we are, halfway through the story, and this is genuinely the part worth sticking around for. Because it's the part where Konami finally admits what the actual problem was and does something about it instead of just patching around the edges. The real fix didn't come from a better polymerization. It came from getting rid of polymerization entirely, at least as a requirement. In 2006, a structure deck full of ancient Roman-themed animal warriors quietly rewrote what Fusion summoning meant in this game. The Gladiator Beasts didn't need a spell card at all. Each one carried its own built-in Fusion trigger activating when it won a fight, letting you combine it with another Gladiator Beast from the field directly into a Fusion monster from your extra deck. No polymerization, no hand cost, no 3-card toll. And the real stroke of genius, the thing that actually solved the original resource problem instead of just hiding it, is what happened to the materials afterward. Instead of getting torched in the graveyard forever like every Fusion before them, the used Gladiator Beasts went back into the deck. You could draw them again, you could fuse with them again. Konami had finally figured out that the anime's version of Fusion wasn't broken because it ignored cost. It was broken because it ignored cost, and the real game had been charging interest on a loan nobody could ever pay off. Gladiator Beasts just stopped charging interest. This is the moment the counter-argument from earlier collapses completely. Fusion was never inherently worse than Synchro or XYZ. It was worse because Konami kept insisting on collecting a toll that those other mechanics simply didn't charge. The second Fusion monsters got a way to summon themselves without begging polymerization for permission, without bleeding 2 cards into the graveyard every single time. The archetype stopped being a punchline and started winning tournaments. Gladiator Beasts weren't a gimmick deck riding nostalgia. They were, for a stretch, one of the most feared strategies in the game, precisely because they'd finally been allowed to work the way the anime always pretended Fusion worked in the first place. Cheap, repeatable, and free of the graveyard tax that had strangled the mechanics since day one. And once that door was open, it stayed open. Later archetypes kept chipping away at the same toll booth from different angles. Some let you fuse straight from your hand or deck without discarding anything extra. Some brought polymerization itself back as a recurring resource instead of a one-time use ticket. Some ditched the graveyard cost entirely, banishing pieces instead so they could be recycled through other effects later. Every single one of these fixes is really the same fix wearing a different costume. Stop making Fusion pay full price for a magic trick that Ritual, Synchro, and XYZ all eventually learned to perform at a discount. Which brings us back to Curse of Dragon and Red Eye's Black Dragon, sitting in Yugi's and Joey's decks respectively, never actually smashed together in cardboard the way 12-year-old fans imagined. That absence isn't really a tragedy, it's a symptom. It's proof that for the game's entire first decade, the fantasy of Fusion, the anything plus anything, Dream Team energy that made polymerization the coolest card on television, was never something the actual rulebook was built to support. The show sold a mechanic with no downside. The card game spent 10 years quietly, stubbornly, insisting on one, and only started winning duelists back the moment it agreed to drop the price. That's the whole arc, really. Not a card that got worse, and not a mechanic that was doomed from the start, but a decade-long argument between what a spell card promised on screen and what a spell card was actually willing to cost on a kitchen table. Finally settled in Fusion's favor the moment Konami stopped treating imagination as something you had to pay for twice.